The Most Difficult Thing I Ever Did by Michael Miller. I lived at sea for 3.5 years. I served in the U.S. Navy aboard an amphibious assault ship. Its purpose was to conduct beach invasions. During much of the time that I was on board, we were in a war zone off the coast of North Vietnam. Occasionally, we found ourselves in combat, taking incoming rounds from shore-based artillery, or being chased by Soviet-made MiG jets, or being stalked on dark nights by speedy PT boats. As perilous as that was, I remember something even more difficult about that time. It was the storms at sea. Nothing can prepare you for a very bad storm at sea. When my ship was resting in port, I could stand at the very front, the bow of the ship, and look down to the waterline. The distance from the forecastle to the water was over 50 feet, about 5 stories. In the 3.5 years that I lived on this ship, we went through many storms. Most of them did not cause any serious problems, usually just some side-to-side rolling, and occasionally some pitching where the front of the ship would rise up and fall with the wave action. However, on several occasions, we went through some powerful tropical storms with gale-force winds. And 3 different times, we endured full-fledged hurricanes. In the Far East, a hurricane is called a typhoon, but it is the same thing. As our ship approached a really bad storm, we would be given warnings several days in advance. Orders would come from the ship's captain and the senior officers to make preparations for high seas and heavy weather. That meant that everything, and I mean everything, on the ship had to be secured. In the ship's offices, common items like pens, staplers, and tape dispensers could become unguided missiles during the worst of a storm. In the sleeping compartments, things like books, cassette players, and coffee mugs had to be locked away in a secure place. The ship's galley suspended its regular meal service and only handed out cold sandwiches for the duration. However, not many people were interested in food during a bad storm. All the ship's doors to the outside decks were watertight, as were the doors between the compartments below the main deck. All the ship's watertight doors were ordered sealed shut during heavy weather, and of course, no one was allowed outside on any of the exposed decks. During one hurricane, I had the misfortune of being scheduled to stand a watch on the ship's bridge from midnight to 4 a.m. My main concern during those 4 hours was to hold on to something secure as the ship rolled sideways as much as 35 degrees and simultaneously pitched through the high seas. My second concern was to keep from barfing, but I was not always successful at that. From the bridge, I could watch as the ship's bow would dip and slice into the oncoming waves. I saw the mighty waves crash over the forecastle, the front deck, with enough force that the spray would reach the windows of the bridge, which was another 5 stories above the main deck. When I think about that hurricane, there is a strange image that remains vivid in my memory. When my 4-hour watch was finished, I cautiously made my way down to the main deck as the ship kept rolling and bucking violently. I got to the ship's mess, the dining hall, and I saw that it was completely empty. All the tables and chairs had been stored away, but I noticed that there were many very large cases of saltine crackers stacked on the floor. Saltines were known to help settle one's stomach during these nasty days and nights. I took a couple of sleeves of saltines and headed down to my sleeping compartment. I climbed into my bunk and tried nibbling on the crackers, but I had to devote most of my attention to holding on to the bunk as we continued to plow through the worst of hours of the storm. Later in life, I have talked with people who have never been to sea, people who have told me that they knew what it was like. They would often recount some disturbance during a commercial airline flight and talk about it as if it was a comparable experience. Now, I have been through some very bad episodes on commercial planes, and I know that they can be very scary. However, I can assure you that they don't come close to being in a hurricane at sea. At sea, 800 miles from the nearest landmass. The effects of a bad hurricane at sea can persist for many days. The very worst of a storm can last for over 24 hours, and it might be a week or more before the seas have calmed enough so that crewmen are allowed outside on the exposed decks again. During those long days and nights, you will get little sleep. You may or you may not eat, and you may or you may not hold down what you eat. However, you will be required to continue the ship's work. The ship has to be steered. The engine has to keep running. The electricity and the plumbing has to continue working. The radar and the communication seamen have to continue doing whatever it is that they do. And finally, there is the question of what goes on in your head. During the terror of the worst hours of the storm and during the days of discomfort before and after it, you think about a lot of things. You think about the ship's manufacturer and you wonder if your ship is fit enough to withstand the beating it is taking. You think about the skill of the men whose job it is to conn or steer the ship through the troughs and waves that can be larger than a 5-story building. Some guys would think about their family and their friends and their hometowns. Some thought about girls they had met or girls they would like to meet. Many guys prayed. Admittedly, I was not very religious in those days, but I did start a conversation. It went something like this. I don't know what you've got planned, God, but could you lighten things up a bit? That conversation continues to this day. Thank you for listening.